There was kind of an old joke in the former Soviet Union about the economy. The joke went, "How does your economy operate?" And the answer was, "Well, it's simple. The government pretends to pay us, and we pretend to work." And I guess you could probably ask the same question about the American news business today. And the answer would probably be, the government pretends to tell the truth, and reporters pretend to believe it. And it's maybe a bit of an oversimplification, but it's really not too far from the truth, because reporters are kind of trained to look to the government to tell them what is happening and what is real. And I think a lot of them, it's not necessarily that all reporters are conscious of this, but they're sort of trained into thinking along those lines, and consequently they sort of become complicit in a lot of things that the government says. In the next hour or so, I hope to provide you a lot more insight into how the process of news management works and how it's evolved over the course of the 20th century. Before I get too far into it, I'd just like to give a little personal background and talk a bit about how I got interested in the topic of the news media and UFOs. I have kind of a standard academic background. I got a degree in biology from the University of Minnesota back in 1973, and worked for a time as a technical writer and in medical research, and then went back to graduate school and got a degree in science journalism from the University of Minnesota. And I'd always been very interested in the UFO topic since I was a kid. In fact, one of my early teachers in junior high school was Donald Kehoe's sister. In fact, Donald Kehoe occasionally mentions visiting Ottumwa, Iowa, which is where I grew up. So the topic, it was kind of in the background, and I did a lot of reading on it. And over the years, as I became interested in science, I took an interest in the research that was going on into the biochemical origins of life and how life got started and all that sort of thing. And it was clear to me back in the late 60s, early 70s that most of the evidence suggested that biological life was probably very common in the universe. There were lots of reasons to believe that even then. And I was curious about why scientists in particular seemed to be very resistant to looking at the UFO evidence, since it didn't take a lot of imagination to conclude that if there was life elsewhere in the universe, they could evolve technologically beyond where we're at now, and they could possibly come to the Earth. But there was a sort of a real intense resistance to this idea in the academic community. And my first thought about this was, well, maybe it's just kind of the standard resistance that scientists have toward anything new. There was a very influential book written years ago called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, and what Kuhn said basically was that scientists come to believe so strongly in their ideas or their theories about how the universe works that when they're confronted with something anomalous or something really unusual that challenges their beliefs, their instinctive reaction is just to, ignore the evidence essentially and go to their graves without ever acknowledging that there's something wrong with their theory. Well, that seemed like a plausible explanation for the resistance that was being expressed, but I began to look into it a little more, and actually if you look at public opinion polls and surveys of scientists and engineers, at the grassroots at least, they're really not that resistant to the idea of UFOs. They really are pretty open-minded about it. They may not know much about it, but they're not that resistant to looking at the evidence if it's presented in the right way. So the ridicule toward the UFO topic didn't seem to be originating entirely from scientists. It seemed to be coming more from the news media, which was in turn kind of a reflection of government policy. Now, one of the things that stands out when you look at news media coverage of UFOs generally is that there is an absolutely yawning gap between the way the topic is portrayed in the regional or small town newspapers and the way it's portrayed in what I call the elite news organizations, that the Time Lifes, the CBSs, the New York Times, and so forth. If you look at the coverage, in small town regional press and TV, they're pretty much open to it. I mean, they of course do poke fun at it now and then, but generally they're a lot more open, a lot more willing to report what's going on. than the elite news organizations. And as you move up the chain, move up the food chain, or however you want to describe it, toward the elite news organizations, there's more and more resistance and skepticism and just a general tendency to censor the subject altogether. So this is just a fact. It stands out from a lot of different studies that have been done over the years. And that seemed to be interesting. It gave me some indication that maybe there was something going on sociologically at the national level to influence media coverage that wasn't happening at the small town newspapers. And no one had ever really taken a look at this issue in detail. There's been speculation over the years that perhaps there's some form of censorship going on, but nobody has really, at least as far as I'm aware, looked into how that might happen or how it might work. So, my approach to the topic was, I assume that if there is censorship going on, it's not the kind of thing you're going to be able to document with government documents, because it's going to be a covert activity, and therefore there's not going to be anything down on paper, or if there is, it's going to be very tightly classified and not available to the public or through FOIA or anything like that. So my approach to this general problem of the news media's handling of the UFO topic is kind of historical. Maybe I could have the first transparency up there. There's a quote that's attributed to Mark Twain. I don't know exactly where it comes from, but he says, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme." And I agree with that. I think that their institutions tend to behave the same way when confronted with similar situations. Now, to kind of illustrate this phenomenon of the resistance to reporting a UFO event, or a flap, if you want to use that somewhat antiquated term, I picked a case that I was intimately familiar with, and that was the UFO activity around Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1975. I had a very close personal friend who happens to be in the audience today, as a matter of fact, named Chuck Pinson, and he lived in Montana back in 1975. He was working as a radio disc jockey, and he called me one day and said, there's UFO activity going on around here, and a lot of the UFOs are hovering over the missile silos, the ICBM complexes around Malmstrom. And this was interesting to me because I had seen nothing about it in the news, in my local news in Minnesota, and I couldn't find out anything about it through the standard news channels. And so, I started doing a lot of research to see how much coverage this had gotten in the local press, in the Montana press. And maybe you can give me the second view graph there. In the mid-1970s, there was an enormous amount of very bizarre activity happening in and around Malmstrom Air Force Base. And it was a subject of considerable press coverage because some of this activity, whether it was related to UFOs or not, had to do with cattle mutilations. Now, cattle mutilations are a very controversial topic, and there's lots of theories about what's causing it and so forth. I'm not really going to get into that too much, but I wanted to call that out because the cattle mutilation phenomenon made the UFO subject important to the citizenry of Montana. There's a lot of ranchers there, and they were losing cattle for some unknown reason. And the fact that people were seeing anomalous lights flying around in the sky caused a lot of attention because people were theorizing that perhaps there was a relationship between these lights, and maybe there were helicopters or military operations or what have you. So there was a lot of interest in the local press. Could you just give me that? Okay, I guess this is just a small sample of articles. Maybe you can give me the third view graph there, the third transparency. One of the interesting things about the press coverage at the time is that the interest of the UFOs in the ICBM complexes was reported in all of the major newspapers in Montana, even the big city papers, the Great Falls Tribune, and there was one other paper. And I was hoping that I'd be able to read this, but this highlighted area here discusses, I believe, the the fact that the UFOs were being seen over the ICBMs. So this was very well known in the local community, and obviously, any reporter with half a brain who reads that, something, whether it's helicopters, UFOs, or whatever, that's interested in our nuclear weapons, that's a pretty big story. If it just happened once, you might just write it off and say, well, that could disappear in the morass of news, daily news happenings. But this went on for a period of several months. It was an extended period of time, and it generated considerable amount of press coverage locally. But yet, if you try to find news coverage of these events outside of Montana, it's very difficult to do that. There may have been some coverage peripherally, maybe in Idaho or local regions, but it was pretty much confined to the Montana area. As far as I know, this was also true of a lot of the other UFO activity that was happening along the northern tier military bases at that time. That was reported in a book called Clear Intent, later called the UFO Cover-Up, I believe. Well, this, of course, happened in 1975, and it wasn't until December 13th, 1977, when this story finally began to emerge into the national press. And where did it emerge? Well, it emerged in the National Enquirer. And maybe I can have viewgraph 5 there. Okay, that's number 4. That shows. Yeah, go to 5, I guess. Sure. I didn't know exactly how this would be set up, and it's a little harder for me to read the news clippings than I expected. Okay, this is the story that appeared in the National Enquirer. I'm sure some of you have seen the movie Men in Black, where Tommy Lee Jones, in the role of a government cover-up artist, points to the tabloids and he says, "If you really want to know about UFOs, read this." It was kind of a clever joke because, in fact, a lot of the coverage that the National Enquirer did at that time was quite accurate. It was very accurate. This story was written by Bob Pratt. But the interesting thing is that if you talk to the average person, the intellectual elite type person, their image of the National Enquirer, of course, is that it's a very tawdry and suspect publication, not like the New York Times or something like that, which is, of course, completely believable. But, of course, the New York Times doesn't cover these types of stories as a general rule, and they're very, very reluctant to do so. They have to be practically dragged kicking and screaming into covering this topic. And when they do, they tend to leave out a lot of important details. So that was 1977. So it took 2 years from the time the events actually happened in Montana till the time they surfaced in the National Enquirer. Now, another 2 years were to pass before the story finally broke in the national press, in the big city papers, particularly the New York Times and then later the Washington Post. Freelance writer Patrick Hui, I think his name is pronounced, sold a story that appeared in the New York Times Magazine. I thought this was interesting because the New York Times had plenty of time to cover this story. I mean, this was an old event. It was well documented locally, very well familiar to residents of Montana, and yet, they never assigned one of their own reporters to do it. It was done by a freelancer, and that often is the case when UFO stories get covered. The reporters, the professional reporters, won't touch the story, but the stories do get written in some fashion, usually by a freelancer. Now, a case like this is interesting because it raises some legitimate questions about the accuracy and objectivity of the news media when it takes so long for a news story to propagate. We're sort of led to believe that if a child falls down the well in Idaho or something, you read about it, the next day in your paper or it's on the evening news or whatever. But it's not the case with UFOs. It takes a long, long time for these stories to emerge from the area where they took place, and then maybe gradually over a period of many, many years they wind up getting some attention, but only through tremendous effort on the part of freelance investigators and UFO researchers and so forth. This is a phenomenon that is, it's really well illustrated by this one case, but there are many other cases that you could pick that would illustrate the same phenomenon, and I cite a number of other examples like this in my book. The Hudson Valley case was another one that got a lot of good local attention in the media, but again, was not treated very well in the national press. And the Belgian sightings, I can't remember the year, I think it was 79 or something like that. There was only one story that I could find about that in the mainstream news media. It was in the Wall Street Journal, and basically he made fun of the whole thing. So this is a pattern that you see time and time again. Now, Napoleon is supposed to have said that you don't really need to censor the news if you can just delay it. If you delay it long enough, it ceases to become news. And I kind of suspect that idea is being applied to the UFO topic. Now, as I said earlier, there's a real dichotomy between the way the UFO topic gets covered at the grassroots, small-town papers, and the way it's covered by the elite news media. And I refer to these two conceptual poles as folk reality and official reality. Folk reality is kind of what ordinary people experience, and official reality is kind of a reflection of what official Washington wants us to think about or wants us to believe, whether it's about UFOs or anything else. Now, another aspect about the missile silo story is that it had obvious national security implications. This is very important, I think. Anything that's threatening our nuclear force has to be a national security issue, and if it isn't, then you have to ask what is, because that's about as threatening as you can get. And we also know now, thanks to people like Robert Sellis, who've come forth to talk about similar events in the mid-1960s, that this was not the first time this has happened. The UFOs visited the ICBM complexes around Montana in 1967 and shut down, according to Air Force personnel, 2 complexes of ICBMs through some unknown mechanism. And that's quite well supported not only by the testimony of Air Force personnel, but also by government documents. So it seemed to me that that was really a clue to understanding news media behavior at the national level. If UFOs are a national security matter, which they clearly are in these 2 cases, then there seemed, at least in theory, there ought to be some effort made by the national security establishment, the military intelligence community, to try to keep this kind of information out of general circulation. Now, I call your attention to view graph 6, which was just, I don't know if that was up on the screen or not. Could you put number 6 up again, please? Okay, this is an item from the New York Times that just appeared about 6 or 9 months ago, I think. And it says, CIA sought to plant news in Cuba in 61. Basically what it says is that during the Cuban Missile Crisis period, the CIA had the ability to inject propaganda stories directly onto the UPI and AP wire services. And I just wanted to call attention to this story because it illustrates that although the news media would have us believe that there's this kind of Chinese wall between the news media and the government, the reality is that the news media, the news organizations and the government, particularly the intelligence community, work very closely together on national security related issues. And this is just one of many, many examples which I cite in my book. And to illustrate this point, I actually devote 2 chapters, one to censorship and one to propaganda, to show how the news organizations work with the government on national security related issues. This is a phenomenon that actually started here in the United States, at least, in World War II and began to mushroom over time. Basically, in my book, I ask 3 main questions. Is censorship possible in a supposedly free and open society? How does deception work based on historical evidence? And then what evidence exists that such methods have been used in the UFO controversy? Now, as I said, during the past half century or so, particularly, and really pretty much throughout the 20th century, the U.S. government has always looked to the major news organizations and elite journalists to influence public opinion. And this, the roots of this actually go back beyond the 20th century, back to the Civil War and the Spanish-American War and so forth. But This really got a lot more sophisticated in World War I, particularly because of the British. The British was running a global empire, and in order to run a global empire, they had to control what people believe about the world. And so the British government, the British military particularly, forged a lot of close alliances with the news media in Britain. And of course, the news media tends to be owned by wealthy aristocrats, and so they share a lot of the same objectives that the military has. They basically want to maintain the political, social status quo. And so there was kind of a good fit between the military and the news media. In World War I, the American public initially was very much opposed to entering the war. They tended to kind of see World War I as a businessman's war. There was a lot of kind of, you might say, left-wing opposition to getting involved and so forth. And the British government, which was locked in this kind of unending stalemate with the Germans, needed to have the U.S. enter the war on their behalf. Otherwise, the situation might never have been resolved. And so what they did was they turned their entire propaganda machine away from Europe and toward the United States. And the objective of this was to swing American public opinion back toward, a pro-war stance. And this was a huge, huge operation, very, very sophisticated. For example, the Reuters wire service or news service was totally devoted to the transmission of anti-German propaganda. They didn't transmit any real, accurate news whatsoever. President Wilson, who initially was kind of opposed to this sort of thing, eventually got behind it, and he lobbied for formal press censorship, but it failed to pass Congress by one vote. There was something called the Sedition Act of 1918, which virtually prohibited free speech against the war during World War I. In other words, if you were an anti-war protester of the type we knew so well in the Vietnam War period, you simply could be locked up just for speaking out against the war. That just was not permitted during World War I. Now, they tried all sorts of interesting techniques to sway public opinion, and one of the more innovative ones was something called the 4-Minute Men, it was called. And this was an organization largely of volunteers across the country, people who were opinion leaders. And they were, what they would do is, if they were attending a movie or a play or some public event, they would stand up, in an apparently spontaneous outburst of support for the war and give an impassioned plea for their fellow countrymen to rally against the evil Kaiser and all this sort of thing. This, to the average person watching this, it all seemed very spontaneous. But in fact, this was a nationally organized propaganda program. It employed, many hundreds of people nationwide, and they would just show up and give pro-war speeches. Now, in my book, I kind of point out there's a lot of parallels between what PSYCOP does with UFOs and this organization called the 4-Minute Men, because PSYCOP just sort of, these guys show up whenever there's a public event and they put their own spin on the situation. And, they don't necessarily need to be aware that they're participating in a propaganda program. They may actually have been, at least in the World War I case, they may actually have been in favor of the war. They may actually have believed that. But the government was channeling this zeal for the war in a manner that would affect the public opinion at large. All of this was organized by an organization called the Committee on Public Information. And the Committee on Public Information was run by a guy named George Creel, who was a leading progressive journalist. The brilliant thing about the way the World War I propaganda was orchestrated in the United States was that the government was able to enlist the support of a lot of the leading journalists of the day to support the war effort. So they actually became incorporated into the propaganda apparatus and carried out many of the functions. It's one thing that I may have failed to stress earlier, that if you're trying to deceive the public or fool people, it's kind of a two-step process. The first step is censorship. And the objective of censorship is to simply close off public awareness of actual events. And you see this a lot anytime there's a war. You know, the first thing they do is they prevent the journalists from going out to the front or whatever, is try to prevent the public from learning what's actually going on. Once you've done that, you can create what's called a pseudo-environment or a false picture of what's happening by injecting propaganda into the media. So it's a two-step process: censorship followed by propaganda. Now, in World War II, this whole thing became a lot more sophisticated. For one thing, the British government and the American government joined together in a much more close relationship than they had had prior to this point. And they began to develop a lot of their methods and put a lot more money into the mechanics of censorship and propaganda. And it became so sophisticated, but that they really couldn't be administered by one organization anymore. The British were leaders in propaganda throughout, the 20th century. In fact, they taught the Nazis a lot of their best lessons about how to run a propaganda campaign. They were, they were just the leaders, and the Americans, particularly in World War II, the American government personnel were kind of naive about how all this works and how effective it was, and they were kind of skeptical about adopting these methods. But eventually they did, and I think the American government has carried this on even further than the British government ever could have believed. Could you put up view graph 8 just a second? A lot of people are skeptical when you say that, public opinion can be marshaled in this fashion, but okay, there we go. There was an organization in Britain in World War II called the London Controlling Section. This was a group of very highly placed British aristocrats who were at the very center of all of Britain's deception programs. And from this small group of very influential people radiated expanding circles of disinformation and confusion. They were just, that's all they did was plot ways of hoodwinking the German intelligence. And they were very, very good at it. A lot of the methods that they developed, as I say, were carried over into the United States and applied on a much larger scale. And during World War II, also another thing that happened was that there was a much closer relationship between the news organizations and the government. The sort of whatever thin veneer of independence existed between the news media and the government just pretty much broke down completely in World War II. The generals and the journalists were on the same team, and they really didn't question very, very much what the military was doing, and those traditions kind of carried on into the Cold War era. Propaganda in the U.S. was handled by something called the Office of War Information, the OWI. And as I said, this really consolidated ties between the news agencies and the U.S. government. After the war was over, the U.S. was confronted with a new series of obstacles or a new series of threats. Particularly, nuclear energy was a big issue, and the Soviet Union, the Cold War, as we now call it. And a lot of the censorship shifted from wartime, World War II related matters to the nuclear energy and other areas of science, and it began to propagate out through many other areas of science. The U.S. news media progressively began to embrace the idea that the U.S. government was locked in a perpetual struggle against evil of all sorts, particularly the Soviet Union. Now it's terrorism. You can pick your enemy. There's always one available there to become the boogeyman. Could we have view graph 9 for a second? Now, the general assumption held by most media managers and journalists was that working with the government was basically a good thing. It was a patriotic thing. And so there wasn't really any feeling that they were doing anything wrong. They'd been doing this kind of thing with the government throughout World War II, and so participating in government deception campaigns was just a natural thing to do. This is a obituary of Sig Mickelson. Sig Mickelson was, as I said, first director of CBS TV News, and he was essentially the liaison between the Central Intelligence Agency and CBS News. CBS was very, very close with the Central Intelligence Agency, and for all I know, still is. But there was just, if you could leave that up there a little bit longer, I wanted to call attention to one. If you could move it down or move the item up. He comments he's quoted in the obituary here saying something to the effect that I didn't raise an eyebrow about cooperating with the CIA back then. So he's just kind of expressing the casual attitude that a lot of people in the big news organizations had about working with the Central Intelligence Agency. They didn't see anything wrong with it. It was perfectly natural. And I think that, if you understand that attitude, you begin to understand that, when the UFO situation began to develop, it wasn't at all unusual for them to be rather restrained in the way they handled a lot of UFO-related material. Now, in the early 50s, the Central Intelligence Agency began spending a great deal of money on what it called its propaganda assets inventory. And this was a group of about 800 individuals, news organizations, publishing houses, all sorts of organizations like that. And it was orchestrated pretty much by a guy named Frank Wisner. And the organization, the propaganda machine, became known as Wisner's Wurlitzer. And the idea was that Wisner claimed that he could play any tune that that the U.S. government wanted the world to hear. They had such effective control over the media at all levels. Now, a big problem began to emerge with this, in that censorship began to really get out of control. And I've read that today, or at least several years ago anyway, the U.S. government had something like 1 trillion pages of classified information. This idea that the public ought not to know what's going on began to really take root in a big way in the U.S. government, and more information became censored, and the tendency to spin news events was increasingly common. Let's see. I kind of describe, there's a lot of reasons, there are many reasons why the intelligence community likes to work with journalists and why journalists like to work with the intelligence community. And I refer to this as the revolving door. It's not unusual for leading journalists to quit their jobs and go to work for the U.S. government in a propaganda capacity or in the intelligence community as undercover agents, or for the news agency, or for the intelligence community to hire people out of the news organizations to work either undercover or as a full-blown intelligence agent of one kind or another. The CIA likes to gather information from all over the world, and the nice thing about a journalist is that you can travel anywhere you want under the guise of being a journalist and gather information, and it's considered a legitimate thing. So you can, it's a great cover for an intelligence agent. So there were quite a few, and probably still are quite a few well-known U.S. journalists that are working in this capacity to some degree or other. And actually, I mention a lot of them in my book. Let's see. Maybe you can give me view graph 10. View graph 10, please. Oh, there we go. Okay, this kind of illustrates the basic theory of deception. And this is applied during most national security situations. Censorship is number one. It closes off access to real-world events. And I quote a famous journalist and public opinion expert, Walter Lippmann, here. He says, without some form of censorship, propaganda in the strict sense of the word is impossible. In order to conduct a propaganda, there must be some barrier between the public and the event. Access to the real environment must be limited before anyone can create a pseudo-environment that he thinks is wise or desirable. Now, Walter Lippmann was extremely influential in changing government policy toward the public in general. In the second phase of deception, propaganda, it inserts a carefully manufactured reality in place of actual events. Lippmann called this the pseudo-environment. If you could move the view graph just slightly up. There's a quote here from Edward L. Bernays. Propaganda is the executive arm of the invisible government. Edward L. Bernays was the founder of much of the theory behind propaganda, U.S. propaganda, and especially the public relations industry. He had an enormous interest, or an enormous effect on corporations and the U.S. government, was a highly paid consultant. Okay, well, what does all this mean? Now, I've talked basically about how this all came about, how this theory of censorship and propaganda and deception came about, and how the relationships developed between the U.S. government and the news agencies. So the next step is to try to look at how this information applies to the UFO controversy. Now, I think probably most of you are familiar with the fact that UFO sightings are not really new. They became a big issue in the 50s, but if you go back to earlier newspapers or scientific journals, you can find things that were, very similar to what we would today call a classic UFO sighting. And in fact, the first person to pick up on this in a big way was a man named Charles Fort, who wrote a series of books beginning in 1919, I think. He wrote a book called Book of the Damned, and Fort would spend a lot of his time in the library, and he would collect anomalous reports of one kind or another and put them together into books, and sort of calling attention to the fact that there were some funny things going on out there that the scientific community wasn't really owning up to or paying much attention to. Well, another major event was 1938, when Orson Welles broadcast his dramatization of H.G. Wells' book War of the Worlds, and it was broadcast on the CBS radio network on a program called, I can't remember the name of the series, but it was a radio dramatization, and it created a large-scale panic across the United States. I think the significance of this event was that it sort of was a wake-up call for government policymakers. It sort of said, look how the public reacted to what seemed to be a real invasion. So there was a lot of sensitivity then developed, about what you can allow the media to do and what you can't to do. Well, in the 1940s, we had the Foo Fighter phenomenon and the ghost rocket phenomenon. The Roswell incident was 1947. 1947 was a pivotal year. That was when the Central Intelligence Agency was created. That was as a result of passage of the National Security Act. And there was also something called the UK-USA Treaty, which consolidated the intelligence gathering operations of the U.S. and Britain and basically all the large major English-speaking countries. Now, I sort of feel that the reason that one of the reasons that the UFO phenomenon became significant in the 50s was that the mass media had become much more influential by the post-war period. And in a sense, the media were kind of acting as a scientific detection system, if you want to think of it that way. It was gathering information about global events, amplifying them, and reporting them to the public. And this was a relatively new thing. I mean, sure, there was news media back in the early part of the century, but it wasn't as pervasive or sophisticated. So, the kind of things that Charles Fort was reporting on could easily escape the attention of the average person because they were so rare. You'd rarely see anything about an anomaly back in the early part of the century. But in the 50s, this stuff really made a big splash in the news media, and I think it really took the government by surprise when all this, when the saucer sightings began happening back in the 1950s. Another theory about this is Richard Dolan's idea, and that is that the commercial real estate or commercial airline pilots were seeing a lot of UFOs and reporting them, and the airline industry was expanding. So that may also have contributed to general awareness that there were a lot of funny things going on out there that the scientific community had not, up to that point, really had to address. Could I have view graph 11, please? There was a man who played a very influential role in World War II deceptions. His name was Dr. R.V. Jones. He wrote a number of books later on, one called The Wizard War, and a few others about his exploits during the war years. And as it says on the picture here, although you probably can't see it very well from back there. Down here it says from 1952 to 1954, he was Director of Scientific Intelligence at the Ministry of Defense. Jones was, aside from being Director of Scientific Intelligence, he was a leading expert in the use of deception. So his whole thing was, how do you fool people? He would dream up very elaborate methods of hoodwinking people and steering them away from something that perhaps the military didn't want the public to know about. And interestingly enough, Jones evidently played an important behind-the-scenes role in planning for the University of Colorado study by Ed Condon, and also, I believe, the Robertson panel report. So I think that's a significant fact that hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the UFO community so far. Now could I see view graph number 12 there? I think these days it's difficult to understand just how big an impact the UFO topic was making back in the 1940s, but this news item, there we go, kind of drives home just how big an issue it was. Eisenhower actually had to make a public statement reassuring the public that we were not being invaded from outer space. And this was actually on the front page of the New York Times. I think it's pretty remarkable. It shows you how concerned the national security establishment was about the perception of the UFO issue at that time. They really wanted to kind of keep the public calm about it all. It's not clear whether they really knew what was going on, or you can speculate about that, but they clearly were getting into the mode of handling public perception. I think there was another thing that was going on, if I could have view graph number 13, and that was that airline pilots were seeing a lot of UFOs at that time, and because they were not any longer bound by wartime censorship, they were talking to the news media. Some of these were quite amazing. This was a case that happened just near Mount Rainier, south of Tacoma, Washington, not far from where I live. And the pilot of this large military transport took off from McCord Air Force Base, and he hit something in midair, and he radioed, we've hit something, or it's hit us. And the plane came down in a flaming wreckage, just came falling out of the sky. And there was, as far as I've been able to determine, there was never any other airplane found, so it's not clear what it hit. But a lot of these reports were appearing in the newspapers, and if you'll give me, let's see. Give me 14 now, please. I'm kind of getting a little bit out of sequence here, but I just wanted to show this since I did have it. Number 14, please. Okay, this was an article in the New York Times saying essentially mankind is warned to prepare for a discovery of life in space. The Brookings Institution did a report, and their conclusion was that if evidence for contact with a race of superior beings was made public, it might cause the collapse of world civilization. Now, whether you believe that or not is almost beside the point. If the government was being told that UFOs, might cause the collapse of world civilization, a lot of people had to take that pretty seriously. Okay, could I move on to number? Let me before I go to the next view graph, I just want to say that another major important event was the UFO wave in the mid-60s. When the UFOs started interfering with intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, I have no idea what was going on, but I know that it happened. And this again raises a national security issue. Shortly, about that time, CBS News broadcast a program called UFOs, Friend, Foe, or Fantasy, narrated by Walter Cronkite. And the gist of it was essentially that UFOs were nonsense and don't worry about it. They're all due to misperceptions of natural phenomena, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to talk a little more about that in a minute. But there you see some evidence that the media is kind of gearing up to try to put a spin on the UFO topic. Let's see number 15, please. Okay, there we go. This is kind of a list of methods of censoring the news. If you study the history of censorship, you can pick out sort of the standard techniques that are used. One is censorship at source, which is where you basically order military personnel and sometimes civilian personnel not to talk about something. That's pretty common. Another is discrete contacts between publishers and media owners. The government can prevail upon the owners of news organizations and so forth to, not to cover certain events or to play them down or so forth. That's fairly common, a lot of documented examples of that. Another one is recruitment of influential journalists. This is very commonly done. If the government wants to influence public opinion, they can do it very effectively if they hire a well-known and influential journalist to become their spokesman. Another one is monitoring and interception of news reports. Next one is lifetime secrecy agreements. Anybody involved in any kind of classified work generally has to sign a secrecy agreement, and they're very strict. Sometimes they basically strip you of your constitutional rights. Another one is surveillance of organizations and individuals. The intelligence community keeps track of what troublesome organizations are up to. There's no surprise there. Another one is theft and confiscation of evidence. Acts of sabotage is another one. Character assassination. Sometimes they will threaten individuals and organizations. They'll harass people through the IRS or one means or another. Occasionally people will be incarcerated. And then the last one on the list is assassination. And we know that the CIA has assassinated various people over the years. Okay, so those are some of the methods. Now, I don't in the time available, or I can't in the time available go through all of these examples and show how they've been used in the UFO controversy, but I do that in my book, and I just wanted to bring attention to a couple of really noteworthy examples. And one was that in order to deal with this problem of the airline pilots reporting UFO sightings to the media, a number of things were done. Could I have 16, view graph 16? Okay, as I said, in the 1950s, the pilots were talking to the media about what they were seeing, and this was just an intolerable situation from the government point of view because it created a huge public relations crisis. The potential for panic and so forth was clearly there, and they were very explicit about what they were seeing. In many cases, there were lots and lots of these reports getting into the newspaper. So to sort of censor this information, a number of things were done. There was something called, if you can go to number 17, please. There was something called JNAP, Joint Army-Navy Air Force Publication, or something like that. And this was an existing regulation that essentially prohibited military and civilian pilots from reporting intelligence-related information to the media. And, okay, give me number 18, please. My understanding is that this existed prior to the UFO crisis, and then UFOs were added to the list of phenomena that were prohibited, that you were prohibited from talking to the media about, assuming you reported it. You were required, I guess, to report the subject, and then it became national security information, which made it impossible to report it to the media. That's, I think, how it worked. Now, there was a big protest about this. Number 19, please. There were about 450 airline pilots who strenuously objected to being censored by the government, and they signed a petition. So it was reported on the East Coast in, I can't remember the newspaper now. It was a New Jersey newspaper, I believe. I just want to read this one paragraph in yellow there. It says, although the pilots expressed themselves freely, they asked that their names be withheld because in most instances, employers had directed them at Air Force insistence to say nothing for publication. So here, it's a very good example of how the civilian pilots were being kind of torqued down on by the military intelligence establishment to keep their reports out of general circulation. This is just one of many, many examples that I can cite to show, censorship being applied in a variety of different ways that I described before. Another interesting case was that in reference to recruitment of journalists into the intelligence community, there was a journalist called Frank Edwards who was kind of like the Art Bell of his day. He was a well-known broadcaster who often talked about the UFO subject on the air, and he got a lot of his information apparently from airline pilots. And at one point, he claims that he was approached by someone identifying himself as General Gamble, who attempted to recruit Edwards into the intelligence community. And General Gamble wouldn't tell him exactly what he was expected to do once there. He just said it was something related to, your interests in broadcasting or whatever. So you have to wonder if that story is true, then what other journalists might have been recruited that we don't know about that actually accepted the offer and went to work for the intelligence community. We don't know that. We do know that a lot of journalists did go to work for the intelligence community. We just don't know what they did. As far as surveillance, an example, the Robertson panel, I think a lot of people know the Robertson panel called for watching the UFO groups because of the impact they might have on public opinion. NICAP, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of high-level CIA people joined NICAP for whatever reasons. So, you can kind of go down the list, and that's essentially what I do in the book here is explain, these same standard techniques of censorship were being applied from the 1950s forward to the UFO topic, and the objective was to get reliable information out of the media as much as possible. Now, once that was done, then the government could begin injecting false information into the media. That's the second phase of the deception strategy. And if I can have view graph number 20 already? Okay. Yeah, these are kind of typical methods of propaganda: cover stories, damage or spin control, bogus investigations, documents and reports, recruitment, use of group leaders to influence lower-ranking members, front organizations, targeting of selected individual groups, psychological manipulation, rumors, misleading information, or disinformation, as it's often called, use of deep cover agents, films and TV programs produced under contract. That's a very common propaganda method that CIA spends a lot of money on, not only in regard to UFOs, but other areas as well. And psychological operations, which is kind of a catch-all for all sorts of creative things that they come up with. Now, just one of the more, I guess there are two remarkable examples that I wanted to talk about in regard to propaganda. I'm not sure how much time I have left. I think I've got about 15 minutes, so I'm going to try to move rather quickly. Oh, 30 minutes. Okay, great. Could I have view graph 21, please? Okay, now there are very few publications that have spent much time covering the UFO topic consistently, and one of them, for better or worse, was the National Enquirer. I'm sure that few of you can read this very well back there, but this is a chronology of the National Enquirer. It has an extremely interesting history. To begin with, in World War II, there was a guy named Gene Pope Sr. who was publisher of an influential East Coast newspaper called Il Progresso. Il Progresso was an Italian language newspaper, and it was generally supportive of Mussolini, which the OSS didn't particularly care for, and so they began to surveil Il Progresso and kind of monitor its activities. And let's see here. They kind of infiltrated the paper is what they did. And let's see, after the war, the publisher's son, who I'll call Gene Pope Jr. or Gene Pope, he graduated from MIT. He was an extremely bright individual. He graduated at age 19 in engineering. That's pretty young to graduate from MIT with a degree in engineering. Now, after the death of his father, Gene Pope Sr., there was some kind of struggle over control of Il Progresso, and Gene Pope Jr. Kind of lost out in this struggle for one reason or another, and he got he kind of left the paper and got a new job working for the CIA. What he said was the CIA's Psychological Warfare Division. Now, in 1952, he leaves the CIA. He's now relatively tender age of 25, and he suddenly finds himself with a lot of money. The source of that money is disputed. Some people think that it came from his godfather, Frank Costello, who was a well-known East Coast mobster. It's not really clear where it came from. Gene Pope himself denied that it came from the mafia. He strenuously denied that. So it's kind of up in the air as to where he got the money. But the interesting thing about Frank Costello was that Costello was also working with the intelligence community. He was recruited by the OSS during World War II because the OSS was having a lot of trouble with Nazi submarines operating off the East Coast, and they feared that certain criminal elements in the U.S. were supplying the German U-boats covertly at night. Now let's see. Okay, could you move it up just a bit again? I've kind of lost my place on the. No, the other way, down, I should say. Okay. Well, Gene Pope finds himself with a large amount of money, and he buys a newspaper from the Hearst Empire. It was called the New York Enquirer. He later renamed it the National Enquirer. Now, the interesting thing about this paper is that it was losing a tremendous amount of money. As a business investment, it was not a very bright idea because it was losing money, and it took many years of constant injection of cash to finally get it to the point where it was making a modest amount of money. It's estimated that about $250,000 was spent before it began to show a profit. Now, $250,000 may not sound like a lot of money to you these days, but back in the 1950s, it was quite a lot of money. It was probably, I'm just guessing, but it was probably well over $3 million in today's money. So you kind of have to ask, well, what's a 25-year-old kid who just left the CIA's Psychological Warfare Division doing with, you know, the equivalent, modern equivalent of about $3 million to buy a newspaper? It's suspicious, to say the least. We do know at that time that the CIA was spending very lavishly on propaganda assets. So, you know, it's been suggested by other writers that perhaps this was just one of many initiatives the CIA undertook to develop its array of propaganda and psychological warfare assets. Okay, well, in the 1950s, let's see. Oh, another thing is that one of the Enquirer's first employees apparently was Bill Bates, who was a former OSS officer. So there are a lot of ties between the National Enquirer and the intelligence community, is the point I'm trying to make. In 1953, we all know that the Robertson panel set out to strip the UFO phenomenon of credibility through what it called a covert mass media program of training and debunking. So this kind of coincides with the development of the National Enquirer. Throughout the 1960s and the 1970s, when UFOs were being such a nuisance to the U.S. government, the National Enquirer establishes a reputation of consistent UFO-related news coverage at the same time when the elite news media is really kind of poking fun at the whole thing. So you have, on the one hand, this somewhat disreputable tabloid paper playing up the subject of UFOs, while the elite, so-called respectable media is playing it down. If you think about that, it's kind of an interesting psychological twist on the whole subject. Another fact about the Enquirer was that apparently Pope was pretty well connected with either the Pentagon or the Nixon White House, because in the mid-1970s, I don't know the exact year, Pope was having trouble getting his paper into the Winn-Dixie grocery store chain, and Melvin Laird arranged for Pope to get the Winn-Dixie executives a tour of the White House or something like that. So you kind of have to wonder, you know, how does this guy who has these, you know, connections to the intelligence community, the White House, and the Pentagon, what's going on here? You know, somebody asked him, how do you get this kind of influence with the White House? And he said, somewhat mysteriously, well, it's politics. One hand washes the other. So, I mean, my interpretation of that is that somehow Gene Pope and the National Enquirer were doing something for either the Pentagon, the White House, or both. It's a reasonable speculation. I can't prove that, but that's kind of the implication based on what Pope himself said. Now, when Pope died in 1988, he was one of America's most wealthy men at the time. I think he was worth about $400 million. Melvin Laird, former Secretary of Defense by that time, gave the eulogy at his funeral. So you have to ask, why is the Secretary of Defense buddy-buddy with this, you know, purportedly sleazy tabloid publisher? There's just a lot of very serious questions there about exactly what the National Enquirer was up to, but we do know that very few publications in the United States had a greater impact on the public perception of the UFO problem than the National Enquirer. Now, was that just a coincidence, an innocent coincidence? Well, I don't think Gene Pope was a very innocent guy if you look into him. I mean, he was pretty sophisticated, well-connected type of person. So I don't think it's stretching things too far to conclude that perhaps that was one of the missions of the National Enquirer, was to try to, as the CIA put it, strip the UFO phenomenon of credibility. It certainly did that. Whether that was the intention or not, I guess you can debate. Maybe someday some information will come up that will allow us to understand that better. I was told by Bob Pratt, a former National Enquirer reporter, that someone's writing a book about Gene Pope, and he's run into quite a bit of trouble getting information about Pope from the FBI because of intervention by the CIA in some fashion. I don't know all the details. Okay, now I want to talk about one other case of propaganda. I guess I've got 30 minutes, so I'll hustle right along. Could you give me view graph 22, please? Okay, I want to get back to that famous program that Walter Cronkite narrated back in 1966 called UFOs, Friend, Foe, or Fantasy. If you've ever watched that program and you're familiar with the Robertson panel report, the similarity between the CBS production and the Robertson panel's recommendation is striking. And when I started working on my book, I thought, well, I'll never be able to establish a tie between these two things other than to point out the similarities between the two and kind of leave it at that, and people just have to make up their own mind. Well, through the grapevine, Michael Swords heard about what I was working on. Michael Swords was with the Center for UFO Studies and was a former editor of the Journal of UFO Studies. And he sent me this memo that he'd found when he was doing research on the Robertson panel. This was found in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution. Very interesting letter. It's written by a guy named Thornton Page, who was a Robertson panel member. He was writing an informal note to a colleague named Fred Durant. And he's kind of reminiscing on the UFO situation. And he says, and I helped organize the CBS TV show around the Robertson panel conclusions. This is dated 1966, just slightly after the CBS program was aired. So I think this is pretty good evidence that the Robertson panel was more than just, remotely involved, that they were actually helping CBS produce this program. So I think there's a lot of significance to this memo, and one is that it provides additional evidence that the Robertson panel's recommendations weren't just recommendations, they were actually carried out. And that furthermore, although the recommendations were made back in 1953, they were still being carried out as late as 1966. So the CIA was actively out there working with at least one major news organization, CBS. If you know anything about propaganda, and I'll get into this a little bit later, there must have been others. Otherwise, it simply wouldn't have worked. Okay, another implication of this memo, let's see here. Okay, well, let me see view graph number 24, I guess. This is kind of a hypothetical diagram showing how, I'm sorry, this is a typewritten version of the memo that I already showed you, and I typed this up because I thought it would be easier for people to read than the handwritten version. You can see there he says, helped organize the CBS TV show around the Robertson panel conclusions. Okay, next view graph, please. That's number 24. Okay, there we go. This is kind of my surmise, kind of a simplified diagram of how propaganda theory works. If the intelligence community is trying to influence public opinion, it simply doesn't do any good to work with just one news organization. And the problem is that if only CBS were singing the tune the CIA wanted to sing, the other competing news sources would call that into question. There'd be a conflict between what CBS was saying, NBC and ABC and so forth. So really, to run an effective propaganda campaign, you have to have all the major news organizations cooperating. And it just so happens that there's quite a bit of evidence to indicate that all of these organizations were very close to the Central Intelligence Agency throughout this period. We don't know in detail what they were doing, but we know they were cooperating with the CIA in many ways. Okay, could I have number 25, please? Can't remember what 25 says, actually, but it says C25, so. Oh, and a basic idea, okay, I'll talk about this in a minute, but a basic idea behind propaganda is that you always try to influence the opinion leaders, the top-level people in an organization, and let them influence everybody else. It's kind of like herding sheep, if you want to put it that way. People are not that different from sheep, I don't think. Okay, the next, could you put that one up again? Now, is there any evidence for supporting the idea that the New York Times also cooperated with the Robertson panel? There's no direct evidence in the fashion that I just cited with CBS. However, I just want to go down this list here of things that we know about the New York Times and the CIA and related matters. Number one is we know the CIA wanted to suppress U.S. or UFO news coverage. That's from the Robertson panel and a lot of other things the government has done over the years. Number two, suppression of UFO-related news would require the cooperation of major news services. New York Times, AP, UPI. I've already talked about the ties between the AP and the UPI and the military intelligence community. Number three, the New York Times publisher Arthur Sulzberger's policy was to, quote, help the CIA whenever possible. So if his policy was to help the CIA whenever possible, and we know they wanted to suppress UFO news coverage, well, you can kind of put two and two together there. Number four, the New York Times content analysis. This is something I didn't go into in detail, but there was actually a content analysis done of the New York Times coverage up through, I think, 1996 or 7, and it showed that the anti-UFO reporting bias in the New York Times actually increased over time. So that's hard to account for that just through random events. Number five, the New York Times seems to have chronic institutional amnesia. In other words, the editors can never seem to remember what happened more than a few years ago when it comes to UFOs. They just seem to forget things that even they've published in their own paper. Six, both CBS and the New York Times supported the famous swamp gas explanation, while most of the national or regional press scoffed at the idea. Again, the New York Times is unwilling to check UFO-related facts. I gave a lot of examples in my book. I can't go into that in much detail here. And they're unwilling to correct mistakes, even when they make some fairly big ones, and you try to point it out to them. They're just steadfastly unwilling to set the record straight. They're also very willing to print anything the CIA says about UFOs, even when it can be shown to be untrue. And I cited a lot of examples of this. Finally, there's a documented history of censorship on behalf of the CIA at the New York Times for national security reasons, and I cite many examples of that too. The New York Times was in the habit of censoring the news, doing various kinds of favors for the intelligence community, and that's very well known and documented. Okay, let's see. Could I have let's see. Okay, well that's getting down toward the end of it. I guess I want to close with my one last view graph there, which is a quote. This is a quote from President Kennedy. In times of clear and present danger, the courts have ruled that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security. I just think you should spend some time meditating on that and the fact that, national security is viewed as a pretty important thing in the government, and they're willing to do just about anything to preserve that. So that's kind of a very brief synopsis of what is, in fact, a very complicated subject. I do have some copies of my book if you're interested in that. We'll be out in the lobby out there. So I want to thank you for coming